So the title attempts to sketch what might be called the great conjunction that the pandemic presents us with. The rise of zoonotic diseases, the threat of mass and human extinction, and the causal links between these calamities and the legacies of colonialism and extractivist capitalism. So I'm really honored to have with me to discuss this, the anthropologist Genese Sodikoff, the artist Maggie Roberts, and the curator and writer Filipa Ramos. And I will introduce these wonderful people in a moment. But I just want to make some prefacing remarks. So one of the premises of this event is that medical and scientific solutions will never be enough to prevent the scale of the crisis of natural, biological, cultural, and social worlds that have been driven by liberal capitalism and are currently manifesting as the COVID-19 pandemic. What is needed is nothing short of a complete reordering of the Western capitalist mindset, which, as an effect of Christian, colonial, and now marketized racial logics, has consistently converted the former colonies, their peoples, plants, animals, and resources into zones of extraction, oriented towards the horizon of death. This moral justification for these morbid power relations was and is premised on a series of Manichaean divisions between the fully human, in inverted commas, white colonial subject and the racialized less than human, between life and non-life, between market winners and market losers, and between humans and animals. These biopolitical and geontological divisions have been used to justify the conversion of living, material, and symbolic worlds into objects of plunder. Importantly, in The Wretched of the Earth, Frantz Fanon draws direct lines between the designation of colonized peoples as subhuman and their perceived embodiment of disease. And here's a quote: "The customs of colonized people, their traditions, their myths, above all their myths, are the very sign of that poverty of spirit and of their constitutional depravity. That is, we must put the DDT, which destroys parasites, the bearers of disease, on the same level as the Christian religion, which wages war on embryonic heresies and instincts, and on evil as yet unborn. The recession of yellow fever and the advance of evangelization form part of the same balance sheet. Today, we are well aware that the very reverse is the case. And obviously Fanon was at the time also, that the advance of evangelizing neo-colonial extractivist capitalism has driven the interconnected climate crises, ecological crisis, and the wave of zoonotic diseases it unleashes. So as philosopher Roberto Esposito has pointed out, immunization prevents those who have it from risky encounters with those who lack it. It imposes boundaries that the common otherwise jeopardizes. Immunization is deeply connected, therefore, with the modern production of privacy and individualism, not to mention nationalist sovereignty. This global extension of bourgeois rights of privacy and individualism is intimately connected to the intolerance and abolition of overlapping and diverse communal, cultural, and ecological webs. It is this abolition of different ways and milieus of living, which once formed a meshwork of differences, that is causing all life to collapse. I would like to end by remarking that infectiousness is an adjective that also describes laughter and sociability. The risky but pleasurable and fertile mosaic of communal social interactions is likewise under threat in our increasingly immunized and phobic modern societies. The balance between immunity and community is becoming increasingly hard to strike, but thinking through this should be a challenge that we set ourselves today. So I would like now to present our three speakers, who we are very honored to have with us today, in the order of their appearance. So first up, we're going to have Filipa Ramos, Filipa is a Lisbon-based writer and lecturer based in London. Did I say Lisbon-born, based in London? Sorry. She's curator of Art Basel film and co-curator of Bodies of Water, the 13th Shanghai Biennial. Her research looks at humans' engagement with animals in the context of art and artist cinema. She co-founded and co-curates V-Drome, a program of screenings of artist films. She's lecturer at the Emrys Art at Central St. Martin's, London, and the Master Program of the Arts Institute of the Hochschule für Gestaltung und Kunst, Fachhochschule Nordwestschweiz, Basel. That's my best German accent.
Very impressive.
She was editor-in-chief of Art Agenda, associate editor of Manifesto Journal, and contributor for Documenta 13 2012 and 14 2017. And if that isn't enough, she edited Animals, the Whitechapel Gallery MIT Press book in 2016, and curated the group exhibition Animalesque at the Baltic in winter 2019 to 2020. And she curates the ongoing festival, The Shape of a Circle in the Mind of a Fish, at the Serpentine Galleries, which is absolutely wonderful. And you can find links to many of the recordings of that on the website and on YouTube. So next up, we have Genese Sodikoff. Genese is an associate professor of anthropology at Rutgers University in Newark. Since 1994, her research is focused on Madagascar's political ecology, including the labor politics of biodiversity, conservation, and cultural and biotic extinction events. Her current project focuses on the impact of zoonotic diseases, particularly the bubonic plague, on Malagasy funerary practices and beliefs in the afterlife. She is the author of Forests and Labor in Madagascar, From Colonial Concession to Global Biosphere, and the editor of The Anthropology of Extinction, Essays on Culture and Species Death. And finally, I'd like to welcome Maggie Roberts, who is an artist whose practice is underpinned by themes of machine vision, speculative worlds, shamanism, and techno-human evolution. She explores these individually and as part of the collaborative artist Orphan Drift, which she co-founded in 1994. Her methodology involves detailed research, immersive multimedia installation, and cross-disciplinary collaborations with scientists, theorists, musicians, coders, digital artists, and activists, collaborating with Ethic Lab and the Serpentines Creative AI Lab. Current projects consider artificial intelligence through the somatic tendencies of the octopus, exploring other systems of perception and proprioception. So thanks very much to all of you for being here. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Filipa to kick us off.
Thank you so much, Josie, for this wonderful and so attuned introduction, and for organizing this event. It's excellent to be able to be speaking to so many people. Actually, the number is quite intimidating. I keep seeing pages and pages of participants. So, and I'm very much looking forward for the conversation we will have afterwards. I will try to be faithful to the time that I was assigned. Also because we've learned that you've been having a very long day, so may the conclusion of the day be light and but also inspiring. So I will start. Tidy the kitchen using organic and not so organic cleaning products. Go for a walk with a dog who is eager to hunt the entire wildlife of the marshes. Read the UK news and feel anxious. Read the Portuguese news as if the UK anxiety wasn't enough. Text with my father about the new heater he's installing in the bathroom. Lisbon is experiencing a rare cold wave. Text with boyfriend about how to make a good fireplace and not burn the wood too fast. Google which countries have no COVID and learn about the collateral effects of the virus such as the weight of lack of visitors in tourism-reliant Pacific nations and the collapse of very fragile economies. There's direct and there's indirect suffering from COVID. Read the Spanish news. I feel I've learned so many languages so that I can procrastinate whatever I'm meant to be doing by comparing international press, and then text friends in Madrid about the snowstorm. Listen to Susan Sontag in conversation with John Berger on YouTube. They talk about fiction and narrative, and I think about how lucky they are not to have the thought of COVID implanted in their brains. Discover and read a short story Sontag wrote about an imaginary travel to China, while I'm wondering when I will ever travel again. Use bleach to remove the stains of some tea towels and then throw the bleach out with the baby and the bleachy water, feeling that the ecologist in me is just a big hypocrite. Fill the bird feeder with seeds. It's cold and I feel the need to compensate for the way humans damage the birds' habitats and resources. Let the cat out, knowing I shouldn't be letting the cat out when the hungry birds are out and about. Drink another cup of tea, looking out the window, wondering how on earth did I end up by myself in deep France with 2 cats, a dog, 2 adopted donkeys, 2 adopted horses, and the many birds I feed, care, and talk to every day. This is a short list of some of the things I did during these days, rather than preparing my contribution to this panel. I'm sharing them with you because they matter. The individual gestures may not be relevant, but they are telling of the times we are living in. They seem to me particularly telling of a state of malaise, agitation, and lack of energy that many of us are experiencing. Blaming the virus for this would be too easy. Blaming the state of global politics and poor health of the world would be the same as blaming the virus. COVID, politics, and the environment are the symptoms and outcomes of a single problem. As the subtitle to this event rightly argues, the deeply rooted foundations of the settler colonialist mentality and the conception of nature as an endless provider of resources and space are leading us to an accelerated form of destruction whose unprecedented effects we are currently experiencing. This awareness led me to become particularly interested in the relationship between the emergence of COVID-19, the implications of global trade on climate change, and on the perpetuation of major inequalities and illegalities. It was during this research that I came across Genese's fascinating work, and that I also interviewed 2 scientists from the Rockefeller Institute, an epidemiologist called Lisa Pomerantz, and a microbiologist called Leah Kelly, who actually participated in one of the fish events that Josie was making reference to, and whose input was crucial to my research. While I was being interested in exploring the interconnections between wildlife decimation, poaching, illegal and legal trades between Africa and Asia, I was also concerned with clumsily stepping into a minefield of cultural difference. Who was I to criticize, for instance, a Chinese wet market for selling exotic species, from which some people might have caught the first cases of virus, when, for instance, I feed my cats and dog beef, poultry, and other animal derivatives, and I'm impatient to get a vaccine whose making caused so much animal sufferance, from the squalene hydrocarbon obtained from shark liver oil, to the rhesus macaques, the baboons, the marmosets, which were used as models for understanding the behavior of SARS-CoV-2 virus in humans, and the many more mice, monkey, ferrets, pig, hamsters, who were literally turned into guinea pigs to test the efficiency of the vaccine. Are a calf, a chicken, a shark, or a baboon less deserving of a good life than a bat or a pangolin? I don't think so. But the danger of attributing responsibilities to practices that seem less urgent, because I have less understanding of them, was too clear to me. I was about to abort my project when Lisa Kelly, in one of our interviews, suggested that I took the poetic license of imagining what the virus might think, might feel, or may want. Coming from a scientist, this suggestion seemed even more extraordinary. Indeed, it opened way to a text I wrote, which was published April, I think, in the Contemporary Journal, which is an online publication that is connected to Nottingham Contemporary. And the title and the text was entitled "What the Virus Wants." In it, and following Leah's advice, I speculated about the agency of the coronavirus, its possibilities, limits, and its paradoxes. Almost 1 year later, I see how I was both right and wrong. I think I was right in avoiding a moralizing interpretation of the virus's actions, as it's even clear now that the SARS-CoV is not a revengeful organism that is punishing humanity for its wrongdoings. I think I was also right in arguing that despite its virtuosity and strangeness to human logics, the virus also ended up by being caught in the web of extractive and exploitative capitalism, reinforcing its uneven distribution of inequality and toxicity, which is something that I talk a lot about in this text. But I was also wrong. And I think I was wrong because by focusing exclusively on what the virus wanted, I failed to imagine what we humans, or at least some of us, might also want from this virus. And as I mentioned in the original text, this we is a very tricky term. We are far from being the same. Some of us are historically and genetically and politically and sexually and geographically better positioned than others in this entanglement we call existence. You and me and them and us may well be the same, but we are not all equipped in the same way. We have been endowed with uneven features, powers, and agencies. Our capacity to act is different, I wrote. So this we of the question, what we may want from the virus, is a multi-layered term that comprised various layers and meanings at once. And the question of what we may want from the virus may indeed be at the same time banal, complex, and uneven, ultimately one which is impossible to answer. And it's banal because the ultimate answer is very simple. We want it to disappear. It's also complex because when you explore the systems that are being put in place to placate the virus, you understand how different people may want different things from it and how they are learning, profiting, experiencing, and suffering, but also benefiting in different ways from it. This led me to discuss how decolonization isn't solely a mode of regaining property to what has been unrightful usurped in the past, but also concerns the present future, and is a fundamental process of trying to prevent that some continue profiting from others, human and non. So decolonizing is actually an ongoing exercise of struggle, resistance, and ultimately, I believe, of imagination. And it's therefore not only looking backwards, but also looking forward or looking in a way, I mean, it's annoying also to use this constant dynamic of past and future as if they were not interconnected, but it's a mechanism that while reevaluating the past should also be looking at the future, because it's not as if we're not engaged in complex and perverse, and to some extent, due to the consciousness we have of these dynamics, even more perverse logics of colonization these days, no? And that will also bear consequences towards the future. And this complexity leads to the uneven part of this whole situation. And here I'm making reference to an issue that is too big to be discussed in the short time that we have, but that nonetheless I want to allude to, also because I've been haunted by it, which is the imbrication between the state and the medical, or even better, the pharmaceutical industry. And on this topic, I cannot avoid recalling, and not without a bit of sarcasm, that etymologically, the Greek term pharmakon, from which pharmacy and pharmaceutical come from, means both a medicine and a poison. And in fact, in modern Greek, I don't know if there's some Greek with us, but in modern Greek, pharmaki can both be a poison or something bitter as well. So the banal answer, that is, we want COVID to disappear, materialized itself in the fastest ever made vaccine, or even better, vaccines, as there are several of them, actually many of them. Previously, the fastest vaccine to be made was for mumps, and had taken the American microbiologist Maurice Hillman 4 years to develop. By the 1970s, the countries that adopted mumps vaccination saw a near elimination of the disease. In the 21st century, however, there has been a resurgence in the number of cases of mumps in many countries that vaccinate primarily among adolescents and young adults due to different factors, one of them being the anti-vax movement. And if someone is interested in this topic, I would strongly suggest to listen. Maybe some of you are familiar with it. There's an extraordinary podcast produced by Radiolab, and there's an episode called "The Great Vaccinator," which is exactly a sort of a portrait of Maurice Hillman and the huge contribute that he made, and very problematic one as well, to the development of vaccines. And if you Google Radiolab, The Great Vaccinator, you will get this episode, and it's like 50 minutes, and it's extraordinary in my opinion. But anyway, as I was mentioning, the last fastest vaccine to be made had taken 4 years, but it had also a very fast effect, and it managed to largely eliminate mumps until very recently. Mumps that, of course, tends to affect children more, but it can be highly lethal, especially for men. This was one of the reasons why it was developed so quickly, because many people in the war and in the army were suffered from it, many men mostly. And so going back to the present, as I was mentioning, the many vaccines, there are currently around 200 vaccine candidates being developed and tested at great speed. And many of them, of course, will not pass this testing stage. And the most popular so far is the Oxford University vaccine, having sold over 2.5 billion doses. The academic institution, together with AstraZeneca, is doling out 500 million vaccines each to India and the US, as well as 400 million vaccines to the European Union, while Novavax, the second highest seller of COVID-19 vaccine, has pre-sold 1.3 billion doses of vaccines. So far, Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna have pre-sold 10% and 6% of the total vaccine doses being manufactured, respectively. And in terms of pricing, Pfizer, for instance, is selling their vaccines, and I convert it from dollars, but it's selling their vaccines at £15 per dosage. So one dosage of vaccine costs £15. And with the current number of doses already sold by Pfizer, that amounts to a current revenue of almost £10 billion sold of vaccines. However, there remains a very large production capacity in the world to make both the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, which is not being used because of first and foremost, because of a single reason, because of intellectual property and patent laws. That is, these vaccines could be made in every country and being locally distributed to populations, but this has not been allowed, because these vaccines come with an ownership. Profit remains more important in life than many, many, many lives, to be precise. The result is that only some labs are allowed to produce the vaccines, and of course, they can only do it in limited quantities. Even if they have immense resources, they cannot produce more. But it's not only this. If you look at the case of Pfizer and Moderna, you see how they largely sold their first year's worth of doses to the world's richest countries. Many of the world's poorest countries, where of course vaccines are even more urgent due to the larger difficulties in containing the virus, the poor lockdown conditions and the lack of good treatment and equipment for people who get sick. And these countries don't expect the vaccine to be delivered before 2022. Basically, they have another whole year at least of anxiety, of economical meltdown, of sickness, of unemployment, and of death ahead of them. And largely, why? Because they are countries that in many cases have been made too poor due to the parasitic occupation of another country in the centuries past. And so this like folding of decolonizing past and future is what I in there like a reality and folding into one another. There have been some attempts to challenge this, and maybe some of you know of this, but for instance, South Africa and India took a proposal to the World Trade Organization to ban the vaccines patents, to ask for the vaccine patents to be banned, so that generic versions could be made. The proposal was blocked, and guess by whom? By the USA, by the UK, and by the European Union. There's after I speak, I will post a couple of links to the chat, one of the Radiolab episode and another one of an article. I mean, there's a historical medical journal called The Lancet that has been publishing a series of reports on the progress of the vaccines and what's happening. And there's a really interesting, even if terrifying report that The Lancet published about this request that India and South Africa made for the pre-patenting of the vaccine that I will share with you if you want to read about it, because it's it's worth reading. It is hard to think that the whole world is going through this major challenge together. It is being given an opportunity to radically reinvent itself, and instead it embraces none other than the same old political, financial, and nationalistic values. This means that the patents will remain more important than many lives. Now and in the future, since these labs will not allow generic versions of the drugs, so this may lead to COVID being eradicated from some areas and of course becoming endemic in others. So to return to what we may want from the virus, and to this question, I'd say that some want the virus to perpetuate difference, inequality, and segregation. And this is the uneven part of the answer I was alluding to. Some of us want money and profit and status and power from the virus. Those same we want to learn nothing from the virus because they are applying the old logics of extractivism and profit to this new problem. This is a true crisis of imagination that we're facing here. The fact that there's a dramatic and yet unique opportunity to rethink relationships, politics, and ecologies, which comes with an invitation to embrace a rational that privileges life to power, the many to the few, wider economic profit to a greater economical damage. Because we also need to consider that the global costs of this inequality of access to health are going to be much bigger than the profit of these few pharma companies. Instead, for some agonizing propensity for self-destruction, this we chooses the old, damaging, vicious options. It is maybe to cowardly numb these dark thoughts that I'd rather cater for the animals, drink tea looking out the window, chat with my beloved ones, and read the news out of pure consumeristic addiction. Yet, I also know that there is another, brighter, more constructive side to this story, which is made by all of those who are trying to individually and collectively imagine new ways of being and of living together. The sole fact of being here together, sharing these ideas, proves it better than any other words. What we can do may seem little at times, but let us not forget that in a manner of anthropomorphic transference, for the better and worse, we are all viral entities too. May we, together, spread our desires, ideas, and beliefs in ways that are as persuasive, contagious, and diffused as the virus and its corporate respondents. And may the virus lessons be transformative and truly progressive. Thank you.
Wonderful, Filipa. And it was great. My heart was so heavy after you described this failed attempt by India and South Africa to actually waive or get rid of the IP on vaccines. And we'll obviously want to return to that, but thank you for your thoughts at the end there as well, because they were needed. So since we have so little time, I think we should move straight on to Genese, and we'll take questions at the end. We'll have a good half an hour, hopefully. So yes, Genese, please, over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Josephine. And I love this forum, this invitation. I really appreciate it. And although I can't see everybody present, I look forward to our conversation afterwards. And I actually have a more conventionally academic style of presentation. So I'm actually going to share my slideshow. Let's see. Okay. Sorry for that unfortunate photo. I want to tell you a bit today about my current research project, well, ongoing research project on the bubonic plague in Madagascar, and a little bit about how I came to study this topic and where I see it going. It's sort of wrapping up the final stages, although the plague hasn't stopped, unfortunately. So a bit of background. I've been working in Madagascar, as Josephine said, for 20 odd years now. And my original work was looking at the politics of biodiversity conservation, focusing on low-wage workers that were carrying out the manual tasks of protecting forest and the contradictions inherent in that. And while I was doing field work in these rural villages along the eastern forest escarpment, I came across a lot of stories about non-human species, sort of just so stories, Kipling style, but also seeing how actually people interacted with wildlife species just in their everyday lives when they were doing their swidden agriculture, etc. So I became interested in these stories, as well as the problems of zoonotic diseases, especially around in villages that are adjacent to primary forest. And in Madagascar, people do cut and clear forest to plant rice. So they come into contact with wildlife while they're doing this relatively frequently. And there are a number of zoonotic diseases. I became especially interested in two because of different sort of cultural factors. One of these was canine rabies, which is a problem in this other region where I'm working now. And then the plague became fascinating to me for a number of reasons. One of them, as was mentioned in the intro, it relates to how the bubonic plague disrupts Malagasy people's sense of their relationship to deceased ancestors. And this has to do with the way the plague dead must be buried. But this whole project is very much to do with multi-species ethnography and these sort of very close daily interactions that rural villagers who are most vulnerable to plague outbreaks, that they experience in their lives because of their proximity to black rats, which are the main reservoir host species of the plague, and the fleas of those rats, which actually are the vectors of the plague. So this is a typical village in the region where I'm working now in the central highlands of Madagascar. And you can see in the background the forest, and this is actually secondary growth forest, but people live in these villages made of mud and dung and thatch around the forest and practice agriculture. So I want to kind of speed up what I know is too long of a paper, but there's a high incidence of plague in Madagascar compared to the rest of the world. And it's been very difficult for them to eradicate the disease for a variety of reasons, including weak infrastructures, blocked supply chains, people's inability to afford raticide and pesticide, people's inability to consume the full dose of antibiotics if they have plague symptoms, which can be treated successfully if you catch it in time. So the plague persists. And I'll tell you a bit about the history of the disease there, but before doing so, I also wanted to give a bit of a more global history of the plague and how it arrived in Madagascar. And as many of you may be familiar, by especially Myron Eckenberg's book called Plague Ports, the third plague pandemic, which is periodized between about 1894 to 1950, was an outcome of European imperial trade networks during this period. So as Eckenberg writes, the plague emerged in China and in a rodent reservoir in the Himalayan borderlands. In China, the plague reservoir is marmots, the most common reservoir species. And then it fanned out from China to all the continents, including Madagascar. Approximately 15 million people died during this period, especially in India, China, and Indonesia. But in other British, Portuguese, and French colonies, recurring plague epidemics continued that were both numerous and severe in some cases. And in Madagascar, it's never been totally eradicated, although in the mid-20th century, the cases were dramatically reduced. And then we see an uptick again. It could be also just a matter of better reporting, but since the 1990s, it's really been an uptick of plague cases. So while zoonotic outbreaks and pandemics have been a lurking risk of global transportation networks for centuries, as we know, I'm focusing today on the infrastructure of the colonial extractivist economy and looking at how this, especially transportation networks, but not only transportation networks, fostered increasingly zoonotic environments, because these transportation networks were for the purpose of getting natural resources and bringing them out and marketing them internationally. So these the extraction of timber and ore, for example, broke down buffers between humans, arthropod vectors, mosquitoes, fleas, sandflies, lice, ticks, and mites, reservoir hosts, and bacteria, as well as quasi-species viruses. So by extractivism, I'm not referring only to the actual process of taking things out of the earth, but also to the global trade that results in uneven accumulation and distribution of wealth and the impoverishment of the resource source countries, such as Madagascar. So when in the late 19th century, when different ports and then countries were hit by the plague, colonial governments focused on plague control measures, which included quarantine, fumigation, burning, the construction of hard masonry that would disable rats from being able to penetrate homes, and just keeping infected animals and vectors at bay. But there's also by the mid-century, the emergent field of vaccinology developed to tackle these emergent diseases. And this also relied on extractivism. And I'm sort of following on what Filipa Ramos just was talking about concerning the development of vaccines. As we know, they relied very much so on animal matter. So animal fluids, bodies, and body parts comprise what Lachlan Jane, an anthropologist, calls the wet net. She just published this brilliant article called The Wet Net. And the wet net refers to this transfer of fluids amongst humans and non-human species that is part and parcel of vaccinology. But she's also discussing that article, the term fluid bonding, which refers to those intimate encounters that humans have with each other and sexual relations and sort of being close, but also humans have with non-human species, the exchange of fluids that is very much a disease risk, as we all know. And this can cross species boundaries as well. Some of you may have read that just yesterday there was a news report that a couple of gorillas at a zoo in San Diego, California, were infected with the COVID virus, probably from zookeepers. So not only have monkeys been used to test vaccines, but serum, blood, amino acids, glycerol, and enzymes from other species are used to detect toxins in vaccines. Sorry, this I should have put up. This is the roots of the plague roots during the 19th century, with the key ports that were affected. So Jane writes that vaccinology after World War II grew into a massive global infrastructure that includes highly mobile geographies of human experimentation involving interspecies fluid exchanges on a vast scale, vaster than any of us can actually imagine. So today, these are pictures from Madagascar, the colonial period. Sorry, I'm never good at lining my talk, keeping pace with my slides, so forgive me. But this is a picture of people lined up to get the plague vaccine in the mid-20th century, which was part of the colonial states' endeavor to control the plague. And this was very problematic, which I'll explain momentarily. But some of you also may have read that for the COVID-19 vaccine, as with many other vaccines, the global pharmaceutical industry relies very much on horseshoe crab blood, because these animals' milky blue blood provides the only known natural source of limulus amoebocyte lysate, a substance that detects a contaminant called endotoxin. And if tiny amounts of endotoxin make their way into vaccines, which are injectable, of course, or other sterile pharmaceuticals such as artificial knees and hips, the results could be deadly. So these are used around the world, and every year these crabs are rounded up from the Atlantic, they're bled, and then returned to the ocean, where many of them die afterwards. And it also some of you may also know that the very word vaccine, vacca, Latin, comes from cow and stems from Edward Jenner's use of material extracted from the lesions in the udders of cows who were infected with cowpox. So he invented vaccination in 1798, and then later believed that cowpox originated from horsepox. So for a while you could get equination or vaccination, depending on what source they used. Today, a company called Tonix Pharmaceuticals is developing a live virus for COVID from the horsepox source that they have. So what Lachlan Jane says in her article is really interesting to me too, in terms of zoonosis. We think of vaccines as a treatment in this sort of extractive economy of animal matter, but vaccines have also potentially been a source of zoonosis, or iatrogenic disease that it's called. That's disease that comes from medical experimentation. And she has, in her article, she discusses this controversial at the time but fascinating story about how HIV may indeed have been a problem of vaccinating monkeys, and the simian immunodeficiency virus may have contaminated certain sources. So it's speculative, but that was sort of suppressed in its day. So that was a tangent, but I want to turn back to the study of the plague in Madagascar as a lens through which to examine how non-human species inhabit extractivist economies. So I'm focusing mainly on the French colonial period between 1896 and 1960, but then I jump to the contemporary context as well, because I've been doing field work there. So I want to show how these colonial projects of resource extraction helped to disseminate the plague on the island, and also produced an environment of fear and resentment on the part of Malagasy subjects, which exacerbated the problem of trying to control the plague. And it also created structural inequalities that have also exacerbated the problem of the plague being out of control on the island. So the Yersinia pestis is the bacillus or bacterium, and this is a gram-negative bacterium, meaning it's one of a class of more dangerous diseases because it takes a different sort of antibiotic treatment. They're just more virulent if it's gram-negative. The most likely way that humans get infected by the plague in Madagascar is from the reservoir host there. It is mainly the black rat, called a ship rat or roof rat. Also, brown rats also carry the plague, but this is the most common rodent that people are in contact with. And this is it's called Xenopsilla chiapis, is the flea, is the parasite, the ectoparasite of the black rat. So what happens is during an epizootic or an epidemic of rats, when the bacteria they already carry inside them multiplies to a threshold that makes them very sick, and there's a huge die-off. It's at this point when rats start to get very sick from this multiplying bacteria inside them that you see a zoonotic spillover event when humans can get infected because the fleas that are on top of the rats leave those rats once the rats die, and then they seek out a new host to feed, desperately starving because the fleas themselves are also infected with Yersinia pestis, which blocks off their sort of digestive system. So they're ravenously hungry, but they can't get enough food. So they're just looking for whatever host they can feed off, and then they die shortly. But it just takes a little bit of that regurgitated rat blood in the human flesh to get a person sick. So bubonic plague is typically, this is the buboes that affects the lymphatic system, but there's not always these typical signs or symptoms of the plague. There's also, it can be relatively invisible. And if you don't get treated within about 5 days, you die. But the bacteria can also breach the respiratory system, and then it becomes pneumonic plague, and that's extremely virulent. If you don't get antibiotics within 48 hours, you're definitely will not survive. And pneumonic plague is what is extremely contagious, and it's airborne. So if you cough or sneeze or touch contaminated objects, you can get infected. So how did the plague get to Madagascar? It arrived in 1898 in the port of Tamatave on the East Coast. And Josie and I just talked about this yesterday. It used to be thought that a ship with carrying the plague came in from India, and then rats came off and then sort of spread the plague around. It was actually more roundabout than that. It was actually 2 steamships, one leaving Madagascar, one coming out of India, met at the open sea on between Madagascar and Mozambique, and somehow the East India Company ship infected the ship from Madagascar, and that's a story. I'll never know how that happened. If it could have been people jumping over to try to help patients on the East India Company ship, or rats might have, maybe they put a rope across the ships and rats walked across. I have no idea. But that ship, passenger ship from Madagascar, came back to Madagascar, was quarantined for a while until a doctor boarded the ship and determined that the sick patients had beriberi. So it was relatively safe. That ship was allowed to continue to the port of Tamatave, where people disembarked, rats disembarked, and a huge outbreak of plague. The first one ever recorded in Madagascar, in the south of the equator, actually emerged there. So again, out of order. The state at that time focused, for plague control, they focused on creating a firm barrier between people's feet and the ground, which was considered the source of this miasma. There wasn't yet a really clear idea of how the plague infected people. So there was still this belief in miasma, but it started to compete with with an idea of the soil itself being contaminated, and then this idea that the soil was a breeding ground of rats once they started to determine that rats were the host species. So they thought that objects could be contaminated even with the miasma at the time. So there was a lot of burning of houses and buildings, burning of grain, anything thought to have been contaminated, quarantine, cordoning off areas, not allowing people to travel, creating these sort of hard masonry buildings and paved ground, trying to eventually, as it was known that rats were the cause, trying to keep rats away from people as much as possible. But then the French started to build the railroad and roads from the port to the capital. And the train, actually, you could chart plague outbreaks. They started to occur along the railway until finally the plague reached the capital in the early 20s. And at a wedding ceremony, there was a huge outbreak of plague, 48 deaths and between two families that were at the wedding. And the state started to get very draconian about their plague control measures. Now, one of the most controversial things that the state imposed at the time was a restriction on Malagasy burial practices. Because in Madagascar, what people commonly did in the highlands was bury their dead in these tombs that used to be subterranean chambers that were covered with a big stone slab, then over time became little house-like constructions that would still had an underground chamber, but it looked like a little house on the top part. And when adults died, in particular, they'd be wrapped in a burial shroud and put in the tomb on a shelf, separated by sex, different shelves for different sexes. And then there'd be a large ceremony with an extended family, feasting, etc. And then after at least a year, sometimes more than 1 year, depending on the family, those remains of those people who died recently would be exhumed for a secondary burial, which is called famadiana. Now, famadiana is a very important ritual because that's when the deceased really make the final passage into the realm of ancestors and become true ancestors. And so you need to do a famadiana for this to happen. Now, the French forbade Malagasy people to bury plague dead. People that died of plague were no longer to be buried in the tomb. And instead they had to be buried in special plague cemeteries, or they had to be buried in separate graves. The reason was that the French were afraid of famadiana. They were afraid that if people went into the tomb, even a year later, that the remains of the plague dead could still be infectious. The shroud could be infectious. Even perhaps fleas survived underground there and could bite somebody, and they thought that a new outbreak would occur. So this was meant as a safety measure, but it was overcautious because a year, or the amount of time that people wait before doing the famadiana anyways, is pretty long. And there was no proof that the active plague bacteria could survive this long, yet they wanted to be cautious. The same for graves. If you had to bury your dead in a separate plague pit, as I call them, because sometimes multiple bodies are put in there, you had to wait at least 7 years. Today, that's the rule. You have to wait 7 years before you can transfer the remains of the dead to the tomb, which is extremely important to Malagasy people. Because if you're not in the tomb, you can't become a true ancestor. You can never make it to the realm of the ancestors. So this law, no one can really find the actual code, the legal code, but this persists into the present. Ironically, though, that people who die of plague who are buried in these separate graves today, now there's a fear that if in fact the bodies remain pestiferous after death, that there's still live bacteria in the bodies, scientists have speculated that it's possible that microorganisms underground in the plague pit could feed off of the corpse, and rats could in turn eat those, and this would help perpetuate the plague underground in rat burrows and rat tunnels, or rats kind of traveling and infecting other subpopulations. So the very policy meant to protect people from outbreaks may indeed by their own logic, by scientists' own logic, may have helped perpetuate and spread the plague. So this whole conundrum persists today. And because people are so terrified of dying a bad death in this profane burial as they see it, many people refuse treatment in the hospital because they know if they die in the hospital, they'll be handled by orderlies and they won't be buried in the tomb for sure. So some people choose instead to remain in the village where they can die a good death and be buried in the tomb. So this, of course, complicates plague control measures as well. Okay. Now, this is a home of a typical village today, where you can see how easily penetrable these mud and dug homes are. There's rat tunnels all around. People find it very difficult to avoid contact with rats and rat fleas all the time, especially during harvest of the rice, when they bring the rice inside their homes to protect it from rats. So it's very difficult for people to escape these zoonotic encounters as much as they would like to. It's just my fieldwork site again in the Highlands. Now, not until 1935 did the colonial state find an effective vaccine against the plague, which they called the EV vaccine. It was named after someone who created it, Evesque. But in Madagascar, the EV, it's a joke. They call it enfant vaza, or the child of the Vaza. Vaza is the name for Europeans, so it's like the white man's child. And it offered at the time protection against the bubonic plague, but not pneumonic plague, which is much more contagious. And it only gave temporary protection, so people had to be re-inoculated in a way that wasn't sustainable. But getting to the point of the use of animals for the testing of one scientist, Ehrenkrantz, tried to figure out if they could create a vaccine that would work for the pneumonic plague. And in his article, he describes the use of rhesus monkeys in the place of the guinea pig as a test animal, the use of beef heart infusion agar to cultivate the Yersinia pestis. They took an Indian strain, which was more virulent. And they also used rabbit serum for another part of the experiment. So several animals are recruited into these experiments at the time. But the vaccine used in the mid-century, from the 1930s to the 50s, did help to reduce plague cases in the Highlands, in the capital, for a long time. And when a new director of the Pasteur Institute there in Madagascar took over, he tried to make the policies about the mortuary policies less frightening to people. Same for the vaccination policies. People were very afraid of vaccines. They continue to be suspicious of vaccines, thinking that often the vaccine itself is what hospitals are intentionally, inoculating people with the plague and giving them the plague, rather than the idea of live vaccine to prevent the plague is people don't trust that theory. So vaccination campaigns were met with suspicion, as were the entire problem of the mortuary policy. So this case offers a glimpse into how this ancient pathogen, Yersinia pestis, is adapting to current environments as well. Because of poverty, sort of in the post-colonial period here, people continue to cut down forests to plant rice. And one theory is that black rats tend to move into human settlements when forest is cut down because they like the rooftops, they're arboreal creatures, and they like the food that's abundant in human settlements. So one theory is that the deforestation actually increases people's exposure to rats. I'm suspicious of this, though, because rats have been around for a long time in ships and everything, and I'm not sure if rats are coming more plentifully after forest is cut, because they've continued to be in people's homes since rats arrived. So I'm not sure about that, but that's one theory. And also people speculate that climate change is exacerbating the problem of the plague because it alters the reproduction patterns of rats and fleas with heavier rains due to climate change, fleas are propagating at different parts of the year. And certainly the plague season has changed in recent times. So some of the infrastructural problems, the problems of poverty, beyond people not being able to afford treatments or being afraid of treatments, is that people will take partial treatments or get what they can get in order to ameliorate their conditions even temporarily. So the use of raticide insecticides, which the state recommends to control plague, people can't really afford to do this regularly. So they do it, partially and sometimes. As a result, both rats are becoming resistant to raticide, and fleas are becoming, and mosquitoes are becoming resistant to pesticides. So we get this problem of resistance. And we're also seeing an emergence of antibiotic resistant plague. And this I see again as problem of wealth, polarization, inequalities, certain people hoarding antibiotics at certain times. People aren't taking their full doses of prophylactic antibiotics when plague outbreaks occur. So this partial consumption of antibiotics keeps the bacteria at lower levels inside human bodies. Rats are becoming more resistant to plague as well. And it may have something to do with this diffusion of antibiotics in the soils, because people do not have latrines for the most part. And if they defecate in the forest and they've had antibiotics, this sort of adds to what's called the resistome, or this collection of antibiotics in the soils that can be mixing with plague bacteria as well. So we have this sort of perfect storm, this mix of resistance occurring. So all of these sort of shows us how the plague is adapting to the conditions of the Anthropocene and sort of the political ecological conditions of the Anthropocene, and which is also shaped by these enduring social disparities that were sort of worsened by colonialism and decolonization at the time, sort of in terms of economics and infrastructure. So what is being done now? First and foremost, there needs to be a revision of the mortuary policy that frightens people so much that they are resisting treatments in the hospital. And only recently, so I'll just go through these pictures. This is a woman showing me her son who died of a plague outbreak in 2015. Family here lost 8 relatives to the 2015 outbreak. I think I'm low on time, so I was going to show you. This is a Famadiana, but I don't think I've done it. I just want to get to my last words here. So now the Pasteur Institute of Madagascar is trying to make some headway in revising the mortuary policy that sort of perpetuates this problem of plague pits, or people's fear of using a plague pit, but sometimes they have no choice if they die in hospitals. And the plague pits perhaps contributing to this multi-species zoonotic environment themselves. They're doing an experiment with rats. These rats now, these sort of sacrificial rats, are being used, will be put into different barrels of soil after they're inoculated with plague, so live plague bacteria, and they'll be buried in these barrels and exhumed at regular intervals, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, the goal of which is to find out how long Yersinia pestis remains active in the soil, active underground. And if they can determine through rat bodies how long the plague can live underground, on the basis of that, they can maybe revise the mortuary policy, enabling people to exhume the remains of the plague dead before this overly cautious 7-year period. But this is, again, an example of, this multi-species recruitment of non-human species into our treatments, our cures, and our remedies for cultural wrongs that happened under colonialism, which wasn't simply a matter of material extractivism, but also what Malagasy believed to be, I guess you could call it the extraction of their land for sure, and their relationship to the disturbance of their relationship to ancestors is very much conceived in terms of land, because the tomb, the ancestral tomb, is what is a symbol of ownership of land. So this is a sort of very integrated problem And I was hoping to get back there this last summer to see the beginnings of this rat experiment. Of course, COVID stopped me, but I hope to go back this summer, if possible, to see the progress there. And I will leave it there. I know I probably went over time, but thank you very much for allowing me the time.
No, thank you, Genese. We didn't want to interrupt you at all. And well, I mean, there's so much to be said about this kind of interaction of Western notions of medicine and kind of scientific principles of hygiene and sanitation, and how they kind of interact with different cultural kinds of orders of handling the dead, of understanding what manifestations like the plague actually kind of embody or symbolize and so forth. So I hope we can come back to this.
I'm sorry, I didn't even see the message in my slideshow sort of.
Don't please don't
apologies.
This is just the inevitable effect of being in Zoom. So I can't just like, you know, make a little gesture to you. But anyway, let's I think we best move on finally to Maggie before we go to questions. So Maggie, if you're there, I can't actually see you. Hold on.
I am.
Yes, there you are. Okay, wonderful. So we'll hand over to you next.
Okay, I'm just sorry, screen sharing. So have you got a picture of the Milky Way?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, well, yeah, chatting to you all yesterday, I still am going to haul myself back into optimism, because I feel like it's our responsibility, or my responsibility as an artist, to work with the imagination that Filipa was talking about, to try and change how we think or how we behave. And but I'm actually really shocked by, yeah, I can't believe we've opted for selfish self-aggrandizement again. But why am I surprised? Anyway, here's the Milky Way, which saturates the skies at night in Southern Africa, because there's much less, there's a lot more space without humans, and therefore without light. So I'm going to talk about a few things. The San Bushman Creative Collective, with whom I worked in 2018, my recent Becoming Octopus meditations with IMT Gallery, and ISCRI, which is the current Orphan Drift Ethic Lab collaboration. Yeah. So underpinning the work and the sensations and provocations we intend them to engage is the importance of making space for the unknown, of placing imagination at the core of exploring different kinds of matter and sentience, of approaching art practice as fictioning, and that as a form of resistance, and the real as a pluriverse. So Orphan Drift's always been interested in art making in which uncertainty and the unknown have agency, and try to involve the machinic, whether the ancient technologies of the I Ching or contemporary AI. Machine vision's been integral to the development of our aesthetic language. We explore technological mediation and disturbance as sites of becoming and change. The work is generally layered, excessive in detail, tactile and patterned, confusing figure-ground relations in ways that are perhaps already octopoid. I like to think so. Fictioning is also key. As a way of counteracting the paucity of imagination that Amitav Ghosh proposes, defined the Western Enlightenment worldview in his amazing book, The Great Derangement. Fictioning gives me agency and usually a sense of optimism as an artist recently. I think some seminal works were reading Donna Haraway's Staying with the Trouble, which made me realise that imagination could be had a political register. Anyway, so Simon O'Sullivan, who coined the term in art practice as fictioning or myth science, suggests that in prophetic fictions, the key register is the imaginary, whilst fiction as friction registers that which escapes the sort of normal discourse we're saturated by. The importance of these kinds of practices is that they offer something different to the what already is, points of inspiration and radical difference that might then be developed and mobilized into a different way of being in the world. He continues, collaboration, or more specifically, collectivity, is also crucial for this operation. How else can one make something that is of one but not of one at the same time? Fictioning inserts itself into the real, and in doing so, it necessarily changes our reality. In Staying with the Trouble, which I mentioned, Donna Haraway talks about speculative investigations that become propositions, that become paradigm shifts. So that's really where I'd locate our work and my work when it's occasionally solo over the last few years. So I don't really know how to convey what spending time with Kalahari Transfrontier Park Bushmen entails. I spent most of it crying, not only in colonial guilt and shock at the brokenness of the culture and the sort of forgotten marginalization, very conveniently by the both white and black governments in South Africa. But mostly I was crying because I was in sensory and cognitive meltdown. In their culture, coincidence turns into magic and some kind of time traveling. They're multidimensional humans who do not operate in contained worlds, materially, temporally, or spatially. They send dreams and insert eerie events into visitors' lives with empathy, tricksteriness, concentration, and leverage. They inhabit an everyday shamanism, while the cost and consequence of colonial capitalism and of climate crisis impact more and more strongly on their barely surviving community. So this is Petrus Falboy, who's the elected community leader. And here he is at sunrise, having read the colours around the sun for the day, being guided by this puppet called Peter, which is a bat-eared fox that one of his dogs accidentally killed, and it's become his main sort of spirit guide, I suppose, in connection to the ancestors. So it's all completely matter of fact, and there's a lot of showmanship in this guy as well. And then they predicted this bird called a trupunt bird, which is a violet-breasted warbler, would come and open my eyes to how to help make change. And sure enough, as we were leaving, one of them came right up to my side of the car and sort of came on the window really hard. There's endless examples of how they seem to be so enmeshed in a web of coincidence. Hardly is the word. There's just not time right now to go into that more. But then this is Isaac Kraper, who with his wife Lydia is a very powerful traditional healer. And he sent out sort of inquiries, dreams, whatever, to get people to go and help them form a creative collective, which invites outsiders to work with them to connect indigenous knowledges with the Western technologically augmented world. They are completely aware that to get stuff onto formats that can be seen on smartphones is the way to go. And there he's looking into the black mirror waters of some pools in the Cederberg mountain range in South Africa, which used to be a very sacred Bushman area with loads of Bushman art, but now it's they're just on this edge of the country in the Kalahari Desert. So they're reclaiming their identity and inserting contemporary non-human fictions into the colonial anthropological perspectives. They want their story expressed in ways that will get the attention of museums and funding bodies, forums to which they've had little access to date. And by defining a code of ethics for involvement with the collective, ensure that Bushmen own all work produced and determine what happens to it. So I suppose we were like facilitators, really, writing proposals, getting lawyers, you know, doing the things that was very difficult for them to manifest. And that's Petrus teaching his son about Mark's animal tracks. So they're trying to keep the old ways alive. And I think that's one of the main things they're trying to get through this proposed exhibition at the National Ezeco Museum in Cape Town, is to replace the sort of dead, dusty colonial Bushman exhibit rooms, which are just so patronising, and function rather as an evolving live communication channel, which explores the Bushman's relationship with the earth in dimensions of coincidence and animism, and invites contemporary audiences to experience their traditional sources of knowledge with open minds and hearts to its importance and relevance today. So the exhibition will expose, they want it to expose the material processes of colonialism. Like, these are my obviously academicized words, but they're completely aware of, you know, there's no totally savvy equal conversation. It's just putting it into ways that would attract the, you know, PhD educated museum people attending all the conferences on decolonisation in Europe at the time. So, oh yeah, we're filming them talking about how they see the future. Because a lot of portents have made them, this group, believe that there's a time of change. Well, that was 2018. We're in a time of change now that they predicted, but I think there's a whole, I don't know, I haven't spoken to them this year. I don't know, I know Petrus got arrested for poaching because he was trying to get into the park to kill a buck in order to feed his immediate community. So I assume they're not, you know, when both of you are talking about the people who are so at the bottom of the economic and unfairness that's so exposed by the COVID pandemic. But anyway, so here, this was really amazing. We got them in the end access to the Ezeco Museum archives of Bushman artifacts and photographs and histories. And a Bushman had never been to the museum before, or into the archive at least. And although we weren't allowed to film in the vaults, which are massive, they were looking through selected huge amounts of folders of photographs and recognizing relatives and ancestors that were very famous, important people. And they want the museum curators to replace the numbers that are on exhibits with stories, with people's real stories and the spiritual and historical significance of the artifacts, the context they were generated in from Bushman perspective, and as part of lineages that are very much alive today. So this was an amazing, very amazing. Oh yeah, that's Isaac in the vaults. I just couldn't resist his He just looks so good. And then Viveros de Castro, who's another person who's really influenced my thinking in the last few years, writes in The Relative Native, only shamans, multinatural beings by definition and office, are always capable of transiting the various perspectives, calling and being called you by the animal subjectivities and spirits without losing their condition as human subjects. For the West, it's a work of purification and separation of unified practice into opposed principles, substances, and domains, into nature and culture, for instance. Indigenous thought, all mythopoetic thought, has taken the opposite route and exists at the vanishing point of all such perspectives. So then onto octopuses. So the possible relationships between two very different kinds of alien to human distributed intelligences, the embodied octopus and the synthetic virtual AI, have occupied much of my artistic focus since hearing my longtime colleague Betty Marenko ending a talk she gave on digital uncertainty with myth-making devices, world-building methods, and defamiliarization techniques can be deployed as acts of resistance against digital capture so that new forms of pattern divination may occur. Make sense of the hybrid neo-ecologies we now inhabit, a mix of the organic, the artificial, the engineered, and the synthetic. Polymorphous, elusive, imitative, the other side of the octopus is the digital. So yeah, I haven't looked back since. For us, the 8-armed, 9-brained consciousness of the common octopus, an intelligence both individual and collective, with its seeing skin, polarized light vision, and chemotactile sensorium, has become a way into reimagining AI. The octopus is, phenomenologically speaking, in a hybrid situation. Its arms are partly self and partly other, which is why it's being called an embodied cognition. Collective and quantum, it does not pick out edges and boundaries or individuate. These are some stills from If AI Were Cephalopod, which is the start of the Orphan Drift production of works exploring octopoid perception and the porous relations between the synthetic and animal intelligence. Or that's a useful way to think. But so that, yeah, two overlapping projections achieve a disorientating disruption of planes in space, and the flat screens further interrupt the sense of scale and surface. And the videos playing on each screen are deliberately generated from mostly similar source material. Iterations happen on different scales, in different textures and opacities. There's subtle tempo differences, bleeds between organic and synthetic, filmed and LiDAR, and Blender generated images. And we're using the LiDAR, like using the machine aesthetics as actual languages or real kinds of matter. And here it's suggesting infinitely complex information processing of the environment by something that's got 8 arms and 160,000 suckers on each arm, etc. Sort of mind-blowing complexity in octopus sentience, which I haven't got. I can get really boring on. So, yep. We never see the octopus AI habitat. It only exists as point clouds. Oh, that's going backwards. LiDAR scans portray the imagined shapes of an AI becoming cephalopod, partly point cloud, partly wireframe, and partly sculptural. So sort of gradually emerging into a screen world with a luminous synthetic skin. The work presents a lot of questions about where the model of intelligence comes from in relation to the development of AI and what the implications of those choices are. I think we're ultimately suggesting we may not know what we're doing in creating these systems. And part of that is how the work is sort of simultaneously being directed at AI, morphing into octopus perspective, and then directed at human exceptionalism, which is the work's on the Orphan Drift website if anyone's interested in having a look. And then somebody told me that shoals of fish probably see predators as a large, sort of blurry, shivering black shape, and that got me thinking about how we might actually begin to decentralize our own artistic, human-centered vision. So we becoming a bit more of an experiment in an art practice way to try and look at how wondering about imagining and researching into how an octopus might experience its world. So yeah, somewhere along the way I learned to free dive, or some bit of a grand term, mostly I snorkel, in the Atlantic Ocean of South Africa, where I've been unable to leave because lockdown here is often following lockdowns in Europe whenever flights are opened up again from the global north. But anyway, but now we're all in massive lockdown. As Josie was saying, it's meant to be the peak. So yeah, the views of there's no horizon, a lot of murkiness, like the kind of David Attenborough versions of underwater that they just film on extremely perfect days with a lot of lights that take out the particulate nature of a healthy, very cold ocean. So yeah, my Becoming Octopus sessions made this year for IMT Galleries, This Is a Not Me online exhibition, was in response to the first COVID-19 lockdown. And the meditations are conceived of as something to deliberately harness spaces of intimacy, self-reflection, slowed time, and help with the anxiety that defined the emergent virtual communities, urging us to value imagination and interspecies communication as tools for inhabiting a future pluriverse and resisting surveillance capitalism's prescription of the real, which seemed to intensify when everyone's online, obviously, through social media, for example. And again, the personhood of the voice, though mostly octopoid, folds seamlessly between octopus and AI in the later meditations. So I was trying to think, so octopuses have polarized vision because of their bent pupils, and I was trying to think about, how to generate image that's quite a foggy, polarized, lit world. And I met this young woman who's a Blender software genius who has mentored me through a very steep learning curve in animation software this year, which has been remarkably useful, or because meditations are about developing a perceptual and aesthetic practice that dismantles our human-centric perspective, as I was saying, both as maker and viewer. And in trying to think about what non-human aesthetics might look like, apart from the softwares, the scripts are informed equally by scientific research, so, some kind of, real anger and shame at the colonial legacy, climate crisis. It's all packed in there gently with my soothing voice. And I've been working with a renowned interspecies communicator called Anna Breitenbach, who part trained with San Bushman as well as in Native American traditions. So each of the sessions immerses the meditator in aspects of octopus consciousness. Oh, and this is because around the edges of their vision, they probably see in black and white. It's all a mixture of images, visualizations we got through the space held by the interspecies communicator, and intense research into a lot of papers being produced about how they see at the moment and how octopuses might see, because they also see with cells in their skin. Anyway, I keep nearly going to all of that. But so yeah, there's some of the meditations are about curiosity, spatial awareness, pain, interaction with humans, what an octopoid revolution in consciousness might entail. And in the last one, the octopoidness is approached by an AI. So the meditations explore issues of gravity, that's more light, getting more and more abstracted, trying to get away from human representation. Oh, can I get that to work? No. I'm just gonna try and get this video up. So computational arts enable us to imagine the environment as pattern and texture, reflecting the octopus's camouflage and skin texturing capacities from multiple viewpoints and scales, and with polarized or bent light vision. This material plasticity allows for a kind of animism that Deborah Levitt refers to in Animatic Apparatus as the only visual language appropriate to future digital world building. We are inhabiting the unintended consequences of mapping rigidity onto protean reality. The ocean, animation, and potentially VR environments can all undo this control, plunging the body into unfixed and immersive immediacies of sensation. Visceral and emotional response reclaim importance over narrative and representation. Yeah, so these are just some clips, but the soundtrack's not happening, hopefully, from your end. Spliced together from the meditations, of which there were 8, as in 8 arms. So this was happening alongside ISCRI, which is what I'm currently, everything moves towards. It started as a fictioning experiment following on from the IFAI or Cephalopod project until I met the design and technology research consultancy Ethic Lab, who are based in Wales. The collaboration itself is an experiment, an interdisciplinary inquiry between multimedia and computational artists, machine learning technologists, cultural theorists, an interspecies communicator, a sociologist, and scientists. And this is one thing where I feel hope very strongly, because it's really hard collaborating across such different languages, and you change through it and influence each other. It's been in development for 2 years now, and through imagining into the somatic tendencies of an octopus, aims to develop an AI not prescribed by corporate capital agendas, and an art experience that dismantles the human-centric worldview modelled by Western representation. So by working with this radical ML lab, our fictioning is approaching the point of sort of inserting itself into the real. Together, we're generating a provocation that no one field of study could assemble. And both the artists and the machine learning team are part of an interspecies experiment where the human, animal, and synthetic intelligences learn from each other. Human agency feeds into a co-evolving experiment to develop a body of non-representational artworks modulated by an emergent AI in ways not really tried before. So I haven't got time to go into I'm not capable, but also I do know a little bit, but I haven't got time to go into how the reinforcement learning in the from environment can be as kind of minimally affected by humans, as in a way, you know, humans have produced every algorithm intentionally. There's no accident or surprise, though we don't necessarily know how they get there, but they're so prescripted by corporate and surveillance agendas that, you know, there are other ways. Like there's an amazing article in the Creative AI Lab database about indigenous thinking being aligned to or spliced into how one might code an AI. So these sorts of questions are, you know, like this is a real project. So, briefly, we propose training an AI that gathers data from sensors placed in an ocean mesocosm housing a common octopus. So mesocosm's natural environment, it's not a tank. It's an enclosed one, but it's a quality of life that I think would be okay. We hope that the octopus responds to art made for it, inserted into its underwater environment, and that these responses will be registered by the sensors. And the speculative art made mostly with Blender together with visual coding, like this sort of octopus skin template is a visual coding creation. It's trying to look at actually making or communicating with non-human worlds. And Deborah Levitt talks about animation being, it produces possible worlds, not the world as cinema does. It's expansive and questions subjectivity, gender, reality, materiality. Animation can model new ways to negotiate the in-between of worlds, open up possible bodies, spaces, temporalities. In animation, what we don't know is a generative space. It's productive. It's productive of mythical dimensions. I don't know how I'm doing for time, Josie.
Yeah, I think we should wrap up now so that there's time for questions.
Okay, I've got one little quote.
Great.
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
So Benjamin Robertson writes on Annihilation in None of This is Normal, the fiction of Jeff Vandermeer, which I'm a big fan. We're in the new weird, a fantastical materiality that renders possible thought that we might not otherwise think. It cannot be reduced or interpreted by human intellect or made possible by the unintended consequences of science or capitalism. It's the increasingly becoming apparent of the unacknowledged by Western worldviews. It's the unacknowledgeable presence of the weird planet. An uncontainable space that is a limiting that cannot be limited, radical difference that cannot be collapsed into the norms established by our physics. We confined by the borders informed by our own minds and the inherent logics containing them. The new weird is everywhere. It has no goal or purpose, no leader or fixed form. It takes place at scales the human cannot perceive or within folds the human cannot traverse. It's always there, but beyond the human sensorium. Coextensive with a bordering against which human thought exerts no pressure and from which it therefore receives no feedback. This non-feedback becomes a challenge to humanity's conception of itself. It's too big and too close to see. It's a materiality defined by distortion. It affects us because it is us. It cannot be affected by us because it is already us. So we need to imagine conditions that afford new ways of thinking that do not assume a stable, grounded reality. It's not about abandoning oneself to fantasy, but to abandon the fantasy that we already always are able to know and control the world. Okay, that's me.
Thank you. Sorry, yeah, my mute is off. Thank you so much, Maggie. Now, I realize that we are quite over time, so I just want to ask maybe one quick question to the three of you, and then open this up straight away to discussion. It seems as though COVID has kind of, or the pandemic, or, you know, to broaden that, let's say the kind of non-linear, uncontrollable effects of extractivist, globalized, colonial capitalism, confront us with a paradox which has to do both with the desire to control this chaos, this crisis, and a kind of revelation of, as Maggie's final quote kind of, you know, summarizes, the impossibility of controlling events, of, you know, in a sense, this this series of crises has revealed the kind of hubris and the limits of that. And yet I find that whilst, you know, we can talk about hybrid worldviews and, you know, polycentric worlds or polyverses, there is nevertheless, as Filipa said at the beginning, this kind of, this minimal thing that seems to define the we, which is to make the virus disappear. And I just wonder if within your own work and within your own kind of framework, that you acknowledge a contradiction between those two positions, where on the one hand, you know, we want science to produce a solution. On the other hand, we know science and the worldview that it kind of extends is one that also involves the kinds of objectifications that are wrapped up within the conditions that have produced this crisis. So I don't know, I just wondered if you had something to reflect on before we open up as to that kind of, that contradiction, that paradox within your own work, and where those edges lie, maybe. So maybe if I start with Filipa, because she's staring at the ceiling.
No, I was wondering about your question, maybe less as a direct answer and more asking, more just in generally wondering if the problem is really science, in a way that science is a research tool that is as valid and efficient as providing versions of the world as art or as any other mode of research. No, and therefore, I think without having an answer to your question, because it's ultimately there's really no way to address it. I believe that is less about the disciplines or the areas, but about the systems that frame them. You know, these frames that just determine the way in which research and efforts are then channeled and applied, and then how they enter into vicious circles and into like pre-formatted logics that are it seems like almost unavoidable. It's like what we were briefly discussing before entering the meeting, like how a monster is created without no one creating it, and it's just like an assemblage of a sort of a Frankenstein of bits and pieces that go here and there. So I don't have an answer, but what I think is that it's not the research systems, is the infrastructure for then those the outcomes of those researches to be circulated that is difficult to bend in a way.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Genese, can I go to you next?
Well, it's an interesting question, because I feel that in my research in Madagascar, there's been this tension between scientific method and the way people confront that culturally and emotionally. So on the one hand, you could be critical of the history of science in one place. On the other hand, when I'm there, there's nothing that, you want more than to see people getting treated and to having science at their disposal to get well. So I don't reject the science. In fact, I think part of our predicament now is too much rejection of the ideal of objectivity in science. And now, the ground beneath our feet is crumbling, and now it's just, the truth is what I want it to be. And so I reject that. I think that's more dangerous. As far as the interventions of science and this interspecies world, I think science will always have to compete with the profit motive. And that's where I think it's not the scientific method as much as the sort of who's using it and whose interest it gets sort of warped at times. And that's what I think, that's where we can sort of marshal our forces of resistance rather than the actual sort of building of knowledge through science. That would be my take.
And just to sort of bridge between maybe your answer and Maggie, I'm just really curious about how these sorts of animistic, indigenous, say, models of reality in your work, in both of your work, sit alongside more kind of systematized, in a sense, or objectivized models of truth, which we call science or scientific. How, I mean, thinking in Genese's case of the kind of the interesting sort of folding into each other of burial practices and the attempt to prevent them through fear of the contamination of microorganisms or that leaking out into the wider environment. And so there are these interactions, and I just wonder, Genese, you're saying you want somehow that ground of science to be more solid, and yet you're sort of constantly negotiating and communicating between different systems or different hermeneutic systems, we could say, different cultural ways of engaging reality. And Maggie also, I mean, in your research into the cephalopod consciousness, the kind of edges or the potentials of AI, you're sort of also moving back and forth between, I guess, Western science in a sense, or that's, its episteme is a Western one, but then also trying to dismantle that at the same time, trying to dismantle that optic. And it seems it's just a very interesting cusp to be positioned on. I just wonder if you have any reflections on that, and if it confounds you at times. I guess I'm curious to hear.
Me?
Could be, yes. I'm looking at that corner of the screen.
Yeah, I thought you were. Well, I think for me, one of the things that's brought some hope is feeling like it's possible to work across, like to work with. We just did an interview with Marine Biology magazine, which isn't coming out yet, but I was trying to be sensitive about how critical I was about, the human set, like that I was talking to really direct scientists, basically, who didn't have a more holistic access to knowledge as an artist might. And I I was really amazed at how intrigued they were about how the interspecies communication works, which is completely a practice based on very ancient traditional kind of ways of visualizing. I'm not answering this very well. I mean, part of me feels like this pandemic hasn't affected the wealthier countries enough, like it's affected the poor people in the wealthy countries enough, and it's racialized clearly, but it hasn't, like for the pharmaceutical companies to be able to think it's preferable to keep making their 10 trillion billion than to make a lot of people's lives all over the world easier is obviously the virus hasn't. I mean, when it first happened, and nobody knew what a pandemic was, well, of like not scientist people. I think I actually assumed this is it. We're going to change, and it's just been increasingly depressing. That is, and Filipa's presentation makes it just so horribly clear that is not the case. So, but I also think there's an increase in people wanting to be in different kinds of community that are not money-based and are more about self-exploration and sensitivity and awareness to the world around them. And people are leaving cities, those who are privileged to have that choice, in droves to find somewhere else to live with a garden. And I don't know, I don't know what I'm saying really. I just think I've never been that. I've always been quite porous. So I'm quite magpie in what I'm interested in, how I work with different kinds of knowledge, I suppose. Obviously, appropriation and being a privileged white middle-class person has become more problematic as marginalized peoples all over the world are finding a voice. But I don't know, I don't find boundaries that useful.
That's very nice. I like the term interspecies communication as well. I think that could be a maxim just going forward. Okay, I'm going to open this up because I'm really aware that we've overrun and it's nearly 6:30. So I'd just like to invite people to raise their hand if they can. I'll try and see you. I'm not sure if that function is actually available because just going through. Otherwise, put your question in the chat and I will then just read it out on your behalf. So let's see. If anyone can see a hand raised in these fields of screens that I'm missing, please just speak or just unmute. Okay. Okay. Well,
I can't see it. I haven't got a hand function.
I don't think the hand function is working here. Hold on. No, it is reactions, the reactions button that should work. So, all right. Well, whilst we wait for questions to come in, yeah, I mean, I suppose, Genese, I'd be really interested to ask you about zoonosis more generally and to sort of hear what you have to say about the kind of relationship between human development across history and these kinds of peaks and troughs of zoonosis, and if it tells us anything about the kinds of transformation, like sort of spike points or climaxes of transformation. I'm aware that the beginning of kind of agriculture and domestication of animals coincided with some of the earliest zoonosis, I think. But I just wondered if you could maybe tell us a little bit more about that. And as a way to perhaps reflect on our moment.
Right. Well, zoonosis has been around probably since the dawn of humanity, because when people started eating, even before starting cooking meat, they'd be, exposed to microorganisms that they might have not been accustomed to. So I think the process of our interspecies interactions over time has also been one of coevolution and coadaptation, and not only in terms of the human microbiome and what we've been able to either, what didn't kill us helped, made us evolve, but also even our sort of non-culinary engagements with other species, where we have I've been writing a paper about lemurs in Madagascar, and what I find also interesting there is as forests shrink due to anthropogenic activities, and people come into closer contact with lemur populations, if they're not being hunted, they might just be protected in a protected area and yet also exposed to more human traffic from tourism or just presence. Lemurs are starting to imitate humans and eat human food. They're starting to gain weight and have some human type health problems. They're starting to look at themselves in car windows and reflections. I find this fascinating, this sort of shared culture, shared primate culture with one another. So we think of these interspecies. My interest in zoonosis now makes me sometimes look at all these sort of interspecies interactions as potentially risky, especially with wildlife, not so much domesticated animals, but it's not necessarily the case. There's other kinds of interactions that are non-exploitative but maybe still damaging depending on what's being picked up or not. So that I find interesting too. And there's other geographers, Stephen Hinchliffe and a group of geographers in England have done interesting work on this idea of boundaries, that we can sort of divide space into wild wilderness protected areas and, human use spaces, is sort of analogous to how biosecurity is treated, that somehow we can hive off humanity to be not infected or, not get zoonotic diseases in some way. But we are, as Maggie said, we are porous creatures, and that sort of flow of circulation and flow of microorganisms is unstoppable. The question is, I think a matter of degree and quantity is the problem, and also unfortunately a lack of exposure as we turn up new microorganisms as we encroach on these primary habitats. It's happening too fast. I think that's the problem. Our exposure to novel pathogens is happening too quickly, and we don't have time to adapt, and that is a problem.
And would you say that is just a result of sort of accelerated, technologized kinds of modes of circulation and extraction, to use the term that we've been using today? The fact that
obviously the dwindling primary habitats in Africa, for one, are it's really a major concern, and the mining industry is very aware of the problem of zoonotic diseases, as they mine ever further into the forest, and people's exposure to these novel pathogens is happening so rapidly. And there's this, unfortunately, by large industry, this desire to salvage capitalism, desire to extract what we can before it's gone. That compounded by climate change, where we're seeing the thawing of ice and I mean, it is quite frightening. And what's frozen underneath are also pathogens that humanity's never been exposed to. So there's all sorts of risks that are happening now that Maggie, I mean, I would hope that the warning, the horns have gone off, the alarms have gone off, and there'll be a move away from that kind of careless activity. And let's hope it's.
If I may just add something to this conversation, what I also find fascinating is how zoonotic diseases in general and what we are experiencing now can be an incredible invitation for us to consider how parts of a complex ecosystem we are, in the sense that if a virus can literally be propelled through the air from one life form to another, from one species to another, there is here a big invitation for us to rethink, also grabbing on the notion of boundaries, the species boundaries, no? Because they are porous, they are, I mean, species are to a certain extent a construction, a mode of archive and a mode of create taxonomies. But they are inviting us to rethink even more the human as an animal, in the sense that we get these, we are vulnerable because we share so much, and because we have so much genetic material in common, even with a bat, that the pathogen that this bat has is also capable of finding itself comfort and of thriving itself in us, no? And so I think it's really interesting from a purely ecological point of view to understand how this virus is also exposing our being, not only animal, but being part of, integrally being part of the world, no?
All other life.
Yeah.
I have some questions. Nora, you've had your hand up for some time, so go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, my question actually follows on really well from what Filipa just said, but I guess it could be a question for all of you. I've just been reading this book on immunity by Eula Biss, which is incredible. She wrote it a few years before this pandemic, informed by previous pandemics and epidemics. Yeah, I find it such a useful guide to thinking through the current times. And one idea that she explores, among many others, about this concept of immunity is actually how our immune system over thousands of years has actually evolved together or because of different diseases and pathogens and viruses. So she, describes research on the immune system and how actually some of our kind of protective cells have actually learned certain strategies from viruses and then copied them for our own benefits. And then also in a different chapter, she writes about cancer and how actually our DNA is partly shaped through cancer also over thousands of years. So I think my question is, you all think about humans as animals and our interspecies connections, but actually maybe these diseases are just as much part of us already, just as much as we are, in the same worlds and ecosystems as plants and animals. These diseases are also already part of us and our own evolution. And what do you think about a kind of actually breaking down a kind of us and them, or a kind of victim and aggressor dynamic between the human and the disease itself? And what would that maybe bring? Yeah, that's That's my question. And I'll put the details of the book here.
I think Maggie, you've got your hand up.
Oh yeah. Well, very quickly, I was talking to a quite sort of not imagination-based person who's a BBC cameraman the other day, and he was saying he's reading a lot about it being a DNA, the next shift of those who survive or are immune, are it's a shift in DNA. And it's interesting that in South Africa, where we were expecting like an absolute Armageddon, 40% of the older genetic pools of Black people are immune, which is just amazing.
That's the first time I've heard that. Yeah, gosh, if there's anything more, any information you have on that, Maggie, please put it in the chat as well. I'd love to hear more. Genese, you've got your hand up.
Oh, well, thank you, Nora, for the reference. That book sounds very interesting. I didn't mean to put my hand up, but I definitely I think that's a good way to look at our sort of circulation of microorganisms amongst species has been going on a long time, and it's part of the flow, part of the matrix in which we live. And what we haven't emphasized here, but of course happens all the time, is humans that sort of infect other species with their pathogens. Well, except that, COVID, the gorilla's getting COVID, but beyond that, all sorts of kinds of sharing that occurs. And so the question is, why, it makes you think that we have become, or we have evolved, especially in sort of Western industrialized societies, we have put cultural boundaries around ourselves where, we don't interact at the same degree, the same level, or the kinds of interactions we have with other species. Maybe that's what's creating these sort of these kinds of boundaries in terms of health at certain points in time that break down at certain points in time and then sort of get re-erected. I'm not sure, but certainly it's interesting. The question of immunity also brings up something that I've been sort of a mystery to me, sort of as an Africanist, that there's been relatively few cases of COVID-19 throughout Africa, with the exception of South Africa and some other places. But in many African countries, the speculation is that it's a problem of underreporting and no one really knows if they're sick, which could be the case. But based on my communications with people I know in Madagascar, including a research assistant who's a scientist, he wonders about, there seems to be a relatively small incidence of COVID-19 there, or people aren't dying from it. So I have all the kinds of questions. And so he's proposing that maybe there is some natural immunity also, perhaps because of other coronaviruses people have gotten in the past. But it's a big question that needs to be explored, because I don't know if it's about reporting. I don't know if it's about suppression of data for political reasons. I don't know if it is immunity. I don't know if it's because it's a largely young population of people. But these are really fascinating questions to me that I don't have answers.
I would just add something to Nora. Thank you for your great for the great suggestion of Eola's book and your question. And I think, well, to answer your question, yes, in the sense, making a little pun with Bruno Latour's famous book, We Have Never Been Modern, I would say that the big myth to dismantle is not so much that we've never been modern, but is that we've never been one, in the sense that we're clearly constituted by a multiplicity of microorganisms and of life forms that remote control us, that define our wishes and our diseases and our lifespan and this and that. And some of them we willingly inserted in us, or we incorporated, and some we didn't. But the fact is that our bodies are constantly a host to all these entities. in which they also have to negotiate the way in which they act upon us, which is why it was so interesting when I was interviewing this Lisa Pomerantz, this epidemiologist, that she was saying that the curious thing is, it was just in the beginning, this was in March, and saying, let's see how this virus behaves, because a virus to thrive, and a good example of a very successful virus is that of the flu, for instance. It can be very lethal. Kills, if it has a very high rate mortality, it reaches a bottleneck situation. And so this virus, in order for it to thrive, it has either to have very arbitrary patterns, and this is what's happening here, in which it's very aggressive on some people, and some other people may even be asymptomatic, but also needs to be moderate in order to be more widespread, no? And in order to multiply itself, now going back to what the virus may want, and therefore becoming part, a constituent part of us. So this whole herd immunity theory is also based on the fact that we all will incorporate, in one way or another, the genetic material of this entity. So I do think that, yes, we are constantly being porous and permeated by by different forms of life and non-life, being virus and non-life. And I think that Genese's reference to Lachlan Jane's research on wet net and porosity is also highlighting those entanglements and those porosities that we experience consciously and unconsciously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's so much we don't know. We know less than we know, definitely, and of course the situation is mutating at a very, very rapid rate, and that's kind of creating outcomes that are perhaps unexpected, like increased transmissibility. As yet, we still, in the UK, with this new strain, which is supposedly 70% more transmissible, we don't know yet if it's less fatal. It certainly doesn't seem to be. So whilst I've heard this thesis of the virus needing to become less lethal in order to kind of like be more successful, we're not sure whether that's actually happening. So it's very, yeah, the sort of the almost starburst kind of sense of different strains emerging all around the world and taking hold of different populations in different ways. It doesn't seem to kind of have settled down into any coherent pattern, if it ever would. And also, it's going to be really important to start to understand what this mass vaccination program really means, you know, how it also starts to interact with immunity. When I say I say that in a very qualified way, given all the points that have been made so far. I just want to go to David, because he's had his hand up, David Johnson, for a long time.
Okay.
Then I think we've got one more question in the chat, and then I think we should draw this to a close because everyone's been here for such a long time. But David, over to you.
Okay, hi. Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, hi. Just a question for Maggie, actually, please. At the risk of, well, I mean, there's such big questions being dealt with, but the phrase non-human aesthetics was used, I think, by you. I'm really fascinated by this, and how when you were talking about the octopus and the way it perceives visually through its skin cells, I think you said. This is fascinating to me because I'm interested in kind of non-visual or non-optical visual perception, and I just wondered if you could just talk a little bit more about that. I suppose slightly narrow, but I mean it kind of widens out to sort of the sensor, you know, wider understanding of the sensorium Can you talk a little bit more about
that? Yeah, I might slightly link it to what Filipa was just saying about we're made up of so many, bacteria, virus interactions going on at a molecular level that we're not consciously aware of. And I think, I suppose I was thinking at some points I've thought about how we're so unintelligent with our bodies and so unaware of our surroundings which has been so damaging to everything else around us. And so to try and get my head around what it might be like to be processing information with 8 arms, which all had elements of autonomy from a central processing brain, and particularly to do with sensory input and decisions made to do with light and dark and touch and chemical information and pressure, was a very challenging exercise or self-experiment. And the thing of the seeing skin is because basically no human can really get their heads around octopus or cephalopod camouflage. I mean, it is so hard for us who've got 2 eyes at the front and we're the center of all of our perceiving. Of central importance in all our perceiving, we're the center of it. And so the idea of a skin that is responding to light and has cells that have rods and cones in, and there's these 3 layers of, like iridophores are reflector, and chromatophores have actual color pigment in, and the muscular shifting of layers to do all sorts of things with different colors that aren't actually in the environment, like the iridescent colors and the I don't know, it's a huge topic of how they sensorially put together an Umfeld, a universe or world experience. But it's not vision led in the way we understand vision. I think that's one of the things that interested me. It's sort of more synesthetic or more, I'm saying it like it's a fact. I don't really know.
No, I think it's a fact that we don't fully understand, I guess. And you're talking about decentralizing sensitivity. There's a guy called Raymond Tallis, I don't know who writes a lot about in humans pain, for instance. We feel pain where our flesh or tissue is damaged. We don't feel it in our head, even though it's our brain is apparently supposed to be processing it, and yet the actual pain resides elsewhere in the body. So it may be that other senses can be perceived in a decentralized way, in the way that apparently the octopus does. I don't know.
I think we've got a lot to learn from all non-human.
And also the knowledge of indigenous peoples and other epistemological systems that that are available to us in the human realm.
Yeah, exactly. I think they're becoming more. They're recognised as being more important than they have been recognised as for a long time.
Can I just come in?
Thank you.
So thank you so much, David, for that fascinating question. And I did quickly just want to read out Charlie Lee Potter's question to Filipa. And he says, thanks so much for fascinating talks. A question for Filipa. The creators of the Oxford University vaccine have pledged to make it available, non-profit and in perpetuity, to low and middle income nations. Is that an alternative, inclusive, non-extractivist model? Filipa, I don't know if you have an answer for that, if you know about this.
No, I don't know about this. I was trying to reread the question. I mean, so they have proposed to make the patent available, basically.
They're making, apparently making a non-profit and in perpetuity.
Sorry, it's Charlie here. Sorry, I just quickly say that that's what Oxford University pledged right from the start, that's what they would do. That in order to make this vaccine bought by richer nations, the quid pro quo was that they would provide it always for in perpetuity, non-profit, to low and middle income nations, so that everybody would have the benefit of it. And
do you know what happened?
It's an ongoing model. That
it is a
model.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly what we aim for, right? In my opinion, there should not even. I mean, perhaps you may accuse me of being extremely naive, or maybe I should state that I'm not the biggest fan of capitalism in a way, and of the pharmaceutical industry. But I do believe that the standpoint for any vaccine should be exactly that. For any COVID vaccine should be exactly that. That is made accessible, and that is not a mode of profit, but it's something that is widely accessible. Now the terms in which that is rolling, I don't know, because I haven't. It would be really nice if you could share, if you have a source for that information, or is there an article, if you could share it.
Well, I can just quickly share a Guardian article which just gives you the basics.
Okay.
But I've lost it somewhere. Here we go.
Yeah, no, but that's exactly what I mean, without even there being a difference, because these differences are also so awkward. What is a rich and what is a poor country, and so and this was in November. The information I was gathering in relation to vaccine distribution was just. I mean, I was doing the research last week. So I wonder what happened also. Not saying that this is not in place, but what sometimes could have happened in between this intention and then the logics that are informing the distribution and the circulation of these vaccines that contradict what science. That's why also when Josie was mentioning what's the problem with science, that I just refer that sometimes the problem is not with science, but is with the framing and the infrastructure around it. But thank you very much. This is certainly something I'm going to look at when we finish.
I know South Africa's not expecting to have vulnerable people vaccinated before, like, at least halfway through this year. So there's definitely a time issue. There's a time. I mean, I'm not saying it's not obvious that, like, Britain will vaccinate its own people first, but I think that there's going to be a massive lag in when the lower income countries develop, whatever those words are being used, developing countries or
everywhere, actually, not only. I think it's going to take a long time anyway.
For sure. But I think there's a speech going on in England from what I gather of that there's solutions coming faster. Like, I would totally agree with you. It's going to be ages.
They're talking it up, but most people suspect that it's going to be a lot slower than the claims. You know, it's another sort of moonshot, or whatever. So I'm very sorry, but I think we're heading towards 7 o'clock and everyone is starting to look a little bit jaded. So I would just like to close by saying, firstly, an enormous thank you to you all, and for everyone who's also been here in the audience and asked questions. I'm sort of brought to think of something that Elizabeth Povinelli said. There goes Philippa's cat. In in one of the, I think it's called the underground of the underground. No, it's one of your final
the understory of the understory.
Understory of the understory. One of it is in fact the final installment, I think, if that's right, of the curatorial program, The Shape of a Circle in the Mind of a Fish. And I really recommend to everyone to watch Elizabeth's incredible kind of video statement. And at the end of this, she really talks about how the problem is not so much, you know, with having pride in a particular position that one takes within the world, or a particular worldview, or a fact of coming from a place or coming from a culture. It's more the relation that essentially, you know, has taken hold of our planet, which, you know, obviously stems from a kind of European Eurocentric episteme, which is one of antagonism toward the other places, the other centricities, the other cultures, the other modes of cognition, and most importantly, perhaps uses the word conatus. I think, you know, the other purposes that other peoples, other animals, other life forms have, that have nothing to, or that, as far as we understand, seem to have nothing to do with us, seem to have nothing to do with our purpose or our purposes. And yet they kind of, these other centers of life, of meaning, of purpose, of behavior, create this kind of meshwork that actually holds us without us ever being able to understand that, without us being able to know that. So something about this kind of living in a pluriverse, to use Maggie's word, that is so, it's so important to understand that within that understanding will, by definition, be very partial and needs to be. In fact, that's actually a positive rather than a negative, that we don't need to be pilots who can kind of, you know, move across worlds all the time, but that actually to allow worlds to exist that we know nothing of is actually part of what sustains our world. And I just wanted to kind of end with that, because I feel like, well, Elizabeth had been a guest that we tried to bring, but it hadn't been possible. And so we very much wanted her kind of perspective here. And so, yeah, I'd like to just wrap up with those words, and thank you all so much. And we have maybe one last point. Maybe you can all read the chat, so I don't need to read it out, but yeah. Okay, well, I think that's a lot of thank yous going around.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. It was wonderful to meet you and have this conversation.
Yeah, amazing.
Nice one.
Thank you.
And to see your work. Beautiful.
Thanks, Josie, for making it happen.
Thanks for allowing it to be made to happen.
Yeah. Okay, let's not go there. Cut. It's too entangled.
We like tangles. All right. Good night, everyone.
Have a good night. Thank you so much. And
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.